Before there was Spider-Man, before billion-dollar franchises took over Hollywood, there was something different. A hero without a costume, damaged, strange, and born not in a comic book, but in the wild imagination of a horror-obsessed filmmaker. In 1990, years before he brought Peter Parker to life, Sam Raimi made a superhero film that no one saw coming. It wasn't made for toys, or for sequels, or for brand recognition. It came from somewhere deeper, darker. This is the story of Darkman, violent, emotional, and downright weird film that somehow found its way into theaters, beat expectations, and became a surprise box office hit. It was stylish, tragic, thrilling, and totally unlike anything Hollywood was used to. And behind it all was a young and hungry Sam Raimi, just trying to prove to the world that he could make something bigger than a cabin in the woods. To understand how we got here, let's go back to the late 70s. In Detroit, Michigan, a group of teenagers were doing something no one expected: making movies. Real movies. They had no budget. They used whatever they had. Fake blood made from corn syrup and food coloring. Camera tricks that made the earth feel like it was shaking. That group included Bruce Campbell, Rob Tapert, and a young Sam Raimi obsessed with horror, comedy, and pushing film to its limits. Their project, The Evil Dead, would eventually explode into cult legend status. At first, it was just something they carried around on tape. But then Stephen King saw it. He loved it. And when Stephen King says your horror film is good, Hollywood listens. Suddenly, Sam Raimi had access. His small, scrappy film had cracked open the door, but even as producers began offering him low-budget horror projects, Sam wanted something else. As a kid, he had grown up on all those heroic icons: Batman, The Shadow, Dick Tracy. He loved their mystery, their coolness, but especially their pain. The more broken they were, the more he was drawn in. He didn't want to make a slasher. He wanted to make a hero. There was just one issue. He didn't have the rights to any of those icons. So he did something very Sam Raimi. He made up his own, and in the middle of a messy Los Angeles apartment full of comic books, sketches, and coffee-stained notes, Sam dreamed up Darkman, new kind of hero. Darkman was everything superheroes weren't in the 90s. He wasn't charming, he wasn't happy. He was suffering. A scientist who gets horribly burned in an explosion, left for dead, experimented on, and comes back changed. He can no longer feel pain. But his emotions, they're out of control. And because of his injuries, he can't live among people anymore. He's disfigured, hiding behind scraps of temporary synthetic skin, trying to get back to the life he lost and seeking revenge on the people who destroyed him. Raimi's original script was a mix of horror, tragedy, and pulp action. Think Phantom of the Opera meets The Shadow meets Frankenstein. But making a movie like Darkman meant he had to convince a major studio to fund his idea, which was no small task. Hollywood didn't have superhero blockbusters yet. This was years before X-Men or Spider-Man changed the game. Back then, the only game in town was Batman, and that was Tim Burton's surprisingly huge 1989 hit. So when Raimi started pitching Darkman, most studios just saw a weird horror guy trying to make a superhero movie nobody knew. But Universal Pictures, home to the original movie monsters, was interested. They saw something familiar in Darkman. It wasn't really about a superhero. It was about a monster with a broken heart. Something truly tragic. And that was something Universal could get behind. So they agreed to fund it. The catch: they wanted a known actor to carry the film. At this point in time, Liam Neeson wasn't exactly a blockbuster star. He had done theater work, serious dramas, a few character roles. But when he auditioned for Darkman, he immediately connected with the role. Raimi saw something in him, those eyes, full of sadness and intensity. He could speak volumes, even with half his face hidden under prosthetic makeup. Neeson wasn't a typical hero, And that's exactly why he was perfect. Filming Darkman was chaos. The makeup alone took up to 18 hours some days. Neeson was buried under layers of latex, unable to eat or breathe properly between scenes. The sets were wet and dirty, full of fire, smoke, and strange lighting. The camera moved in unusual ways, flying low to the ground, spinning wildly during emotional moments because Raimi wanted you to feel the unhinged state of Darkman's mind. The tone on set was difficult, too. The studio wanted a lighter, campier version. Raimi wanted dark and emotional. Somewhere in the middle, the film found its identity. Danny Elfman came on board to create the score-fresh, off-scoring Batman. He infused Darkman with sweeping, gothic melodies that made even the most bizarre scenes feel operatic. And Neeson committed 100%, even when the prosthetics cracked, even when the action stunts got dangerous, even when his trailer was the only place of comfort. He never pulled back. And the emotion in his performance, fighting to hold on to his humanity, was the beating heart of the entire movie. Then came the moment of truth. Release day, no one expected Darkman to succeed. There was no big marketing push, no toy lines, no brand recognition. Just a strange, dark, original superhero story dropped into theaters in the heat of summer 1990. Shockingly, it worked. Darkman opened at #1 at the box office. Audiences responded to how different it was. It was tragic, funny, sad, and aggressive all at once. Didn't look like a superhero movie. It didn't feel like one either. Critics were split. Some called it a masterpiece. Others didn't know what to make of it. But the people who loved it really loved it. And among those people, young filmmakers, aspiring writers, comic book fans. They saw something powerful in Raimi's oddball, horror-infused superhero drama. It captured what being a hero really sometimes feels like: lonely, painful, desperate. And it proved something else to original superhero movies could work. Sam Raimi wasn't done with Darkman. The movie led to 2 direct-to-video sequels, though he didn't direct those. They were cheaper, didn't capture the same magic, and quickly faded away. But his original film had already done what it needed to do, gave him a seat at the table. A decade later, the world was changing. By the early 2000s, superheroes were starting to dominate. And when Sony looked for a director to adapt the most important Marvel character of all, Spider-Man, they turned to the same guy who had once created a weird, bandage-wrapped outcast who screamed at the sky. Raimi brought that same emotional core to the Spider-Man trilogy. Peter Parker wasn't cool or confident. He was awkward, heartbroken, trying to juggle love, loss, and responsibility. Those movies had scale, action, and laughs, but at their center was something you might recognize. A hero punished by fate. An everyday person caught between hope and rage. Sound familiar? That's the legacy of Darkman. It's not just a forgotten comic book movie from the 90s. It was the bridge between scream queens and superheroes, between monsters and icons. Raimi would revisit superheroes again and again. And maybe that's because he never stopped believing that our greatest heroes often begin as broken people, hurting, searching, trying to do just one good things. Sam Raimi never planned for Darkman to change his life. It wasn't meant to start a franchise or launch a universe. It was meant to be one story, one man, one scream into the night. But looking back today, Darkman became something more. It was a whisper of things to come, a test run, a beating heart of tragedy that would echo across Raimi's work for decades to follow. After its modest success, Raimi kept moving. He went back to his roots: more Evil Dead, more horror, wild camera tricks, outrageous gore. But there was something about Darkman that stuck with him. It wasn't about blood or scares. It was about pain. The emotional kind, reaching for something that's gone. Losing who you are, And it's no surprise that when superhero films came knocking again in the early 2000s, Raimi was one of the first filmmakers they called. Studios remembered what he did with Darkman, how he put raw feeling under layers of latex and fire, how he made the audience care about a broken man in bandages. So when Sony began developing Spider-Man, a project that had floated in limbo for years, they needed someone who could pull off not just the spectacle, but the heart. Its core, Peter Parker isn't a muscle-bound savior. He's a teenager who never stops losing things. His parents, his uncle, his best friend, his girl, his sense of innocence. Just like Peyton Westlake in Darkman, Peter desperately tries to live in a world that's already moved on without him. When Spider-Man hit theaters in 2002, it became a global phenomenon. A superhero film that didn't just wow us with special effects, said made us feel we were in Peter's shoes. Swinging through the highs, collapsing through the lows. Raimi's fingerprints were everywhere, moments of operatic emotion, sudden horror, even a few visual echoes of Darkman himself, or that haunting shot of Dr. Octopus rising from surgery. Surrounded by chaos, camera spinning with terror. Same way Darkman's world spun when he was reborn in pain. These weren't accidents. They were evolution. Raimi was taking what he did with Darkman and applying it to a larger story, with more money but the same heart. Because even with all the fame Spider-Man gave him, Sam Raimi never stopped telling the same kind of story. Misfits searching for meaning in a cruel world. But here's the tragic twist: even after all the success, some part of Darkman stayed unfinished. Raimi had more ideas. He envisioned sequels with deeper emotional stakes, a story where Westlake tried to regain his humanity, not just his face. He even imagined crossovers. Darkman vs. Ash from Evil Dead. It almost happened, but the studios weren't interested in his vision anymore. They saw Darkman as one of those cult titles that only works in the shadows. Not bankable, not franchise material. And so, Darkman was pushed aside. Direct-to-video sequels were made without Raimi or Neeson. They were cheaper, safer, and lacked the strange beauty of the original. A few passionate fans held on, but for most of the world, the hero in the bandages disappeared. Again, years passed. Then came Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness in 2022. Sam Raimi's return to superheroes. By now, the genre had changed. Marvel was a machine wildly successful, but tightly controlled. Raimi brought his style, his energy, his touch, but it wasn't his. It was a world with rules. Darkman had no rules. Just pain, revenge, and romantic tragedy spinning under a full moon. Still, that old flame burned quietly. A few years after Doctor Strange, rumors started swirling. Whispers in interviews. Nods of interest. Liam Neeson was asked if he'd ever return to the role of Peyton Westlake. He paused, smiled, and said, "If Sam Raimi is directing, I'm in." That simple sentence sent waves through longtime fans. Suddenly, Darkman wasn't dead. He was just waiting in the shadows. Waiting like he always had been to come back. And maybe that's fitting, because Darkman was always about the in-between. A man stuck between life and death. Between hero and monster. Between what he was and what he could have been. When people talk about the birth of superhero movies, they think X-Men, Blade, Spider-Man. But rewind the reels just a little further, and you'll find Darkman standing in that forgotten corner. Not perfect, polished, but raw and real in a way that still resonates. It showed Hollywood that original superheroes could work. It inspired filmmakers to take risks. It gave permission to be weird, to be emotional, to let heroes scream instead of smile. Sam Raimi gave us a character so human, so helpless, so powerfully wounded that we couldn't look away. And in doing so, he made us feel for the kind of hero we usually ignore. not the flawless ones, but the ones who were broken, betrayed, still fighting. Maybe that's why Darkman matters more today than it did in 1990, because we live in a world full of flashy masks and perfect quips, but underneath, we know no one is perfect, and sometimes the real heroes are the ones who wear their pain on the outside. So next time someone says Sam Raimi revolutionized superhero films with Spider-Man, just nod and remember what came before. Because years before Peter Parker ever swung from that first rooftop, a screaming man in a trench coat, wrapped in flames and heartbreak, made the leap first. And his name was Darkman.